So, you thought the 3rd century was wild? Congratulations on surviving Rome's century-long nervous breakdown. You've watched an empire fragment into pieces, somehow glue itself back together, and reinvent everything that made it Roman while insisting it was still the same empire that Augustus had founded. Now pour yourself something stronger, because the 4th century is about to make the 3rd century look like a practice round. This is the century when Rome didn't just change governments or borders, it changed gods. This is when the empire that had spent 3 centuries trying to kill Christianity suddenly decided to become Christian. This is when the eternal city stopped being eternal and a swamp in Turkey became the new center of the civilized world. Welcome to the years 301 through 400 Anno Domini, when Rome discovered that the only thing more dramatic than a political revolution is a religious one. Let's start with the obvious question. What happens when the most successful retirement in imperial history immediately collapses into chaos? Diocletian had barely settled into his cabbage garden when his carefully constructed tetrarch of 4 emperors, ruling for parts of the empire, exploded into civil war. Apparently, the one thing Diocletian hadn't accounted for was human nature. Turns out that when you give 4 people imperial power and tell them to share nicely, they don't. Within 2 years of Diocletian's retirement, 6 different men were claiming to be emperor. 6. At the same time. This wasn't government. This was a historical reenactment of a bar fight with delusions of legitimacy. The chaos lasted 20 years and produced more dead claimants than a season of Game of Thrones. But out of this magnificent mess emerged one of the most consequential figures in human history: Constantine. Constantine was the son of Constantius, one of Diocletian's original 4 emperors. When Constantius died in 306 Anno Domini, in York, England, because apparently that's where Roman emperors went to die. Now his soldiers immediately proclaimed Constantine emperor. This was completely illegal under Diocletian's system. But since when had legality ever stopped a Roman army from making political decisions? What followed was a series of civil wars that makes the 3rd century's chaos look organized. Constantine spent the next 18 years fighting his way across Europe, defeating rival claimants one by one. He was clever, he was ruthless, and he had something his competitors lacked: a really good story about divine intervention. In 312 Anno Domini, Constantine was marching on Rome to fight his rival Maxentius, when he allegedly saw a vision in the sky. According to the story, and yes, we only have Constantine's word for this, which should make you immediately suspicious, he saw a cross of light with the words in this sign, "Conquer," written across it. Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields and banners. The next day, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine's army crushed Maxentius's forces. Maxentius himself drowned in the Tiber while trying to flee, weighed down by his armor like a very expensive anchor. Constantine entered Rome as sole emperor of the West, and immediately announced that his victory proved the Christian God was on his side. Now, you might be thinking, wait, didn't Diocletian just spend the last decade trying to exterminate Christianity? Didn't Christians spend 3 centuries being fed to lions and used as human torches? And now suddenly the emperor is one of them? Yes, that's exactly what happened. And it might be the most Roman thing ever. Taking your greatest enemy and turning them into your greatest strength, through the simple expedient of declaring that you are on their side all along. Constantine's conversion, and we still debate whether it was genuine or political, changed everything. In 313 Anno Domini, he issued the Edict of Milan, which granted religious freedom throughout the empire. Christians went from being persecuted criminals to favored citizens literally overnight. But Constantine didn't stop there. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 Anno Domini to settle Christian theological disputes, because apparently deciding imperial policy wasn't complicated enough without adding doctrinal arguments about the nature of the Trinity. The council produced the Nicene Creed, which is still recited in Christian churches today, making it possibly the most durable piece of legislation in human history. Constantine also did something that would have made Augustus spin in his mausoleum. He founded a new capital. Constantinople, originally called New Rome, though that name didn't stick, was built on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. Constantine chose the location for strategic reasons. It controlled the passage between Europe and Asia. It was surrounded by water on 3 sides, making it nearly impregnable, and it was far enough from old Rome to represent a clean break with the pagan past. The construction of Constantinople was one of the most ambitious building projects in human history. Constantine essentially built an entire imperial capital from scratch in less than 6 years. He imported columns from Egypt, statues from Greece, and craftsmen from across the empire. He created a new senate, a new palace complex, and new forums that rivaled anything in Rome itself. When Constantinople was dedicated in 330 Anno Domini, it was already clear that this was more than just another city. This was the future capital of a Christian empire, an old Rome pagan, traditional, republican in its deepest memories, was becoming a beautiful relic of a world that no longer existed. Constantine ruled for 31 years, which by 4th century standards was practically immortal. When he died in 337 Anno Domini, he left behind an empire that was unrecognizably different from the one Diocletian had saved 50 years earlier. But Constantine's death immediately triggered another succession crisis, because apparently the Romans were physically incapable of transferring power peacefully. Constantine's 3 sons divided the empire among themselves and immediately started plotting against each other. Because why? Break with tradition now. The next 50 years saw a parade of emperors who ranged from competent to catastrophic. There was Constantius II, who spent most of his reign fighting Persian wars and executing anyone he suspected of treason. There was Julian, known to history as the apostate, who tried to restore paganism and died fighting the Persians after an reign that accomplished nothing except proving that you can't turn back the clock on religious transformation. Christianity wasn't just the emperor's religion, it was becoming the empire's religion. Christian bishops wielded more real authority in many cities than imperial governors did. Christian monasteries were becoming centers of learning and economic power. Christian churches were being built with imperial funding on the sites of demolished pagan temples. The transformation wasn't just religious, it was cultural, intellectual, and social. Christian writers like Augustine and Jerome were creating new forms of literature and philosophy. Christian artists were developing new styles of architecture and decoration. Christian theologians were wrestling with questions about the nature of God, the meaning of history, and the purpose of human existence that would shape Western thought for the next 1,000 years. But the 4th century wasn't just about Christianity. This was also when Rome faced its greatest barbarian challenge since the 3rd century crisis. The Huns, nomadic horsemen from the Asian steppes, began moving west in the middle of the 4th century, pushing Germanic tribes ahead of them like a slow-motion avalanche. Gothic tribes that had lived peacefully along the Danube for generations suddenly found themselves caught between Hun armies behind them and Roman frontiers ahead of them. In 376 Anno Domini, a massive Gothic migration reached the Danube. These weren't raiders or invaders, they were refugees, entire tribes, including women, children, and elderly, fleeing Hun pressure and begging Rome for permission to cross into imperial territory. Emperor Valens, ruling the Eastern Empire from Constantinople, made what seemed like a reasonable decision. He allowed the Goths to cross the Danube in exchange for military service. The Goths would become photoradiolite troops who would defend Roman territory in exchange for land and supplies. It was a disaster. Roman officials immediately began cheating the Gothic refugees, selling them spoiled food at outrageous prices and forcing them to sell their children into slavery in exchange for dog meat. When the Goths complained, Roman commanders told them they were lucky to be allowed into the empire at all. The Goths rebelled, and suddenly Rome faced a massive barbarian army operating inside imperial territory with intimate knowledge of Roman military tactics, because many of them had served in Roman armies for years. The crisis culminated at the Battle of Adrianople in 317. Emperor Valens led a Roman army against the Gothic rebels and walked straight into what military historians consider one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. The Gothic cavalry, fighting alongside Hun allies, smashed the Roman infantry. Valens himself was killed, along with 2/3 of his army. The Eastern Empire's military power was essentially destroyed in a single afternoon. But here's where the story gets interesting. Instead of collapsing, the empire adapted. Theodosius, who became emperor after Valens's death, made peace with the Goths and integrated them into the imperial system. Instead of trying to expel or exterminate them, he gave them land, recognized their leaders as Roman officials, and incorporated Gothic warriors into Roman armies. This wasn't surrender, it was transformation. The empire was learning to survive by becoming something new, a multi-ethnic, multicultural state that defined Roman by law and culture rather than by blood and birth. Theodosius also completed Christianity's conquest of the empire. In 380 Anno Domini, he declared Christianity the empire's official religion. Pagan sacrifices were banned. Pagan temples were closed or converted to churches. The Olympic Games, which had been held for over 1,000 years, were discontinued because they honored pagan gods. The transformation was so complete that within a generation, it became almost impossible to find openly pagan Romans in positions of authority. The empire that had been founded by men who claimed descent from the gods now belonged to people who believed there was only one God. And he had been crucified by a Roman governor in an obscure province 3 centuries earlier. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the 4th century was how much stayed the same while everything was changing. Roman law continued to develop and expand. The Theodosian Code, compiled in the early 5th century but based on 4th century legislation, created legal precedents that are still studied in law schools today. Roman engineers continued building roads, aqueducts, and public buildings that wouldn't have looked out of place in Augustus's time. Roman merchants continued trading across 3 continents, carrying goods from Britain to India and back again. The Latin language spread even further as Christianity carried it into regions that had never been under direct Roman political control. Roman educational systems, now adapted for Christian purposes, produced scholars and administrators throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Most importantly, the Roman idea that diverse peoples could be united under common laws and institutions not only survived but was strengthened. The 4th century empire was more ethnically diverse than ever before, but also more culturally unified than it had been since Augustus. The century ended with Theodosius's death in 309 Anno Domini and the permanent division of the empire between his 2 sons. The Western Empire, ruled from Milan or Ravenna, would struggle with barbarian invasions and economic collapse for another 80 years before finally fragmenting into successor kingdoms. The Eastern Empire, ruled from Constantinople, would continue calling itself Roman for another 1,000 years, while speaking Greek and worshipping Christ. This division marked the end of the unified Roman Empire, but it wasn't really an ending, it was a metamorphosis. The empire that had begun as a Mediterranean city-state had become a European, Asian, and African civilization. The empire that had worshipped Jupiter and Mars now belonged to Jesus Christ. The empire that had been ruled by men who claimed to be gods was now ruled by men who claimed to serve God. If you had told Augustus that his empire would survive for 4 centuries by abandoning its capital, changing its religion, and sharing power with barbarian tribes, he would have thought you were insane. But that's exactly what happened, and it worked. The 4th century proved that civilizations, like individuals, can reinvent themselves completely while remaining fundamentally themselves. Rome kept its laws, its language, its engineering genius, and its absolute conviction that Roman ways were the best ways. Everything else, gods, capital cities, ethnic composition, political structure, was negotiable. Constantine's revolution wasn't just about making Christianity the empire's religion. It was about proving that Rome could absorb any change, survive any crises, and emerge stronger by becoming something new, while insisting it had always been that way. The roads still led to Rome, even when Rome was no longer where the emperor lived and prayed to a god that Romans had once crucified. The aqueducts still carried water, the concrete still held, and somewhere in Constantinople, Christian emperors still called themselves Caesar while planning the next phase of Rome's improbable, unstoppable, eternally surprising story. 400 out, the eternal city had become the eternal idea, and ideas are much harder to kill than cities. Next time someone tells you that change is impossible, remind them about the century when Rome became Christian and somehow became more Roman than ever.